Therapists who do couples therapy, how often is it clearly one person in the relationship who is the problem? Different twist. So is a therapist that specializes in working with teenagers, reports that in cases where a parent brings a child to therapy with serious issues whether substance, school performance, or interpersonal issues, in 95% of the cases the problems are caused and or exacerbated by poor parenting. Yup, childhood trauma causes serious trouble that can cause challenges at a young age and extend far into adulthood. We also see parents bring in problem children where the kid is fine. Pretty phenomenal, even. But the parent is convinced the kid is the problem when the parent is the one with the major personality disorder or other issue. Purely anecdotal I know, but a number of years ago my wife and I were having some pretty serious issues. We were on the edge of divorce, and we finally agreed to couples counseling. We had 4 sessions, one together, one where we each talked to the therapist alone, then another with the 2 of us. Right off the bat on the 4th session she sat us down, looked at my wife and said, "Therapists don't say things like this often, but you are wrong. You are the cause of all the problems in your relationship, and if you do not want it to end, you need to make some changes." I did have a brief moment of OMFG, I can't believe a professional is actually telling her she is wrong and I'm right. Best day ever, then thinking what if she can change? Well, the good news is that was 10 or more years ago, and life is awesome. We have one of the best relationships I know of, and especially since the kids grew up and moved out things are pretty great. That's awesome. I'm so glad your wife took it to heart and that you all succeeded. We didn't succeed, but I remember the therapist during the one-on-one saying there is a reason you are husband for. It can't be all your fault. This was after I was actually divorced, but my ex and I had to go to court-ordered family counseling. After the 2nd session, she said to my ex, "You don't need to come back. I can't work with you and I won't tell the court that you successfully completed counseling." Then she turned to me and said, "But you're doing a wonderful job. You're just wonderful." It was very, very odd. I am a therapist. I have seen many couples in my experience in which one person bears more of the responsibility for the chaos or distress in the relationship. In fact, many times couples therapy is a soft introduction to individual therapy for the person that needs it, often someone with anger issues or substance abuse problems. Own and operate a private practice. Been almost 10 years now. It is almost always skewed one way, and often extremely so. My first big career obstacle was overcoming my own desire for acceptance from others. It prevented me from calling out unacceptable behavior due to worry of accusations of bias, negative reviews, etc. I definitely leveled up when I gained enough experience to feel confident in call-outs. It is extremely rare though, and the mark of a clumsy therapist. Imagine trying to take apart a computer, but a part is stuck so you whack it with a hammer. The art of therapy and how you know someone is very good is it'll feel like a regular conversation. You'll have excellent flow, some personal stories and laughs, skills, tips, insight, etc. are integrated smoothly into conversation. Last week had a client messaging escorts while the client is on business trips, giving escorts the address and room number, claims they didn't meet and it's the partner's fault for snooping through their phone, adamant they have done nothing wrong. Messaging isn't cheating. Sometimes it is extremely one-sided. Common is the stronger, relationship skills wise, partner pushing for therapy and weaker partner pulled along. Common split is 60/40 or so. Most common issues: attachment style conflicts, anxiety, communication, lacking personal skills, toxic models, addiction, weak resolution recovery, and realistic expectations about partner life in general. I have seen couples in therapy for many, many years. I learned early on that the problem is usually an interaction effect. As I tell people, it's like bleach and ammonia, 2 excellent things that simply become toxic when mixed together. Years ago in addiction treatment, we had the coke addict husband and the wife who really didn't want him to recover because the coke meant $10,000 income per month. Early 1980s. Who's the problem? We have the cheater and the spouse who hasn't wanted to have sex in the marriage for 10 years. Who's the problem? Who created that distance? Who perpetuated it? What happened to create this schism? We have the one-income household and the spouse who had no idea this called for a 1950s lifestyle where the stay-at-home took care of the household responsibilities like kids, cooking, and cleaning. They never negotiated what their one-income household would look like. Who's the problem? To answer your question, I would say I can pick out the problem person perhaps 20% of the time. Usually it is truly an interaction effect. Two people who simply do horribly as a couple. Sometimes I can see very clearly that one person is over it. Nothing anyone can do to save this relationship. Most of the time I can see what broke in the couple. I would say it rarely one person's fault. I definitely tell the truth to the couple as to what I am seeing. Fully aware that I am a new visitor to their life. Fully aware that I could be totally wrong. Usually what I have in my office is two people wanting to be heard. Brilliant metaphor and examples. As someone who is working towards becoming a therapist currently, these nuggets of wisdom and perspective are very helpful. Thank you for sharing. I'm not a couples therapist, but I do work in the mental health field as a skill builder and have done training in marriage and family therapy. One thing they tell us is that often there is one partner who wants to make it work and one partner who has given up, and that the only way it is effective is if both people are willing to put effort into it. Remove the story. If your trigger is so bad you can't be respectful to a professional in the capacity that they are helping your significant other, it's not the professional that should be backing off. Here. After 15 minutes of counseling, the therapist that my ex picked told my ex that she needed to check into a psychiatric facility and that she was acting abnormally. Of course the ex didn't do any such thing and then sent papers to the therapist from reporting any of this to the court. This was during my divorce. It was a crazy time. The therapist was correct. Pretty often one person is the problem, but the other person is the issue. The issue is communicating, acceptance, or indecision, i.e., one spouse is lazy and a lout and the other person has had to deal with it and grown resentful. A lazy lout after 15 years will never be significantly different to you or erase the frustration you have. You being angry about that won't stop them from being what they are. I actually have several instances of this with my ex-husband. Go figure, it took me so long to make him my ex. Before we had kids, we went to couples therapy because we were just fighting a lot and wanting to work on communicating better. We went to 2 sessions and then we had 1 session where I basically battled my way to get to the office in rush hour traffic, only to find out when I got there that he didn't feel like coming that day. The therapist suggested I have a session on my own since I was there anyway and told me that I was not the problem and that my husband had some serious issues. It seemed a bit much to me at the time and I ended up not going back at all after. But hindsight is 20/20. Yeah. While we were divorcing, he demanded that we put the kids in therapy and chose a therapist to have them go to. I figured what the heck and let him take them during his visits and went to meet the therapist and go through the various steps she wanted to take. After 3 weeks, my ex decided that I must have got to the therapist and tried to break down her door while I was in her office after my daughter's session. He was informed he was no longer welcome on the premises, but I was told I could keep bringing the girls if I liked. She actually refused payment and came and spent 8 hours at court to testify against him during our divorce trial. Finally, I requested a parent coordinator, who is kind of a therapist with some power, because my ex was just difficult and we needed someone in between us. My ex wanted our kids to go to daycare instead of using the nanny we had hired. Together, I might add, because he decided the nanny liked me better. Anyway, he presented his case to the parent coordinator and I presented mine, and the parent coordinator sided with me and said the girls could continue to be taken care of by the nanny. My ex actually filed an ethics violation suit against our parent coordinator, alleging that he had an inappropriate relationship with me, proven by the fact that I had referred to him by his first name in an email I had written. This case, of course, was thrown out, but not without the parent coordinator having to spend money to defend himself. Needless to say, he requested to be removed from our case after that. My ex wanted our kids to go to daycare instead of using the nanny we had hired. Together, I might add, because he decided the nanny liked me better. Oh, this happened to me once, as a nanny. Shocker, I did prefer the mom. She wrote my checks and wasn't threatening to fire me all the time. My now ex and I were told to break up about a half hour into our first couples therapy session. Of course we didn't listen. She also tried to get us to call a pet physic who could read our dogs' minds over the phone for $100 an hour. So, my now ex and I. So, you probably should have called the pet psychic BC. They sounded like they were onto something. One side of a couple telling their experience in couples therapy. Spoiler alert, they weren't the one in the wrong. 8. Professional therapists who say it's very rarely just one person's fault. People saying it was all their fault, not their partner's. I know this is off topic, but my aunt owns a therapy clinic and she says it's surprising how many couples will call to schedule a session and be very civil, and as soon as they think the call is ended, even if it isn't, they will go right back to screaming at each other. My ex and I tried therapy twice. The first after his first DUI. He denied having any responsibility in our marital problems, denied we even had any issues, and denied any problem with alcohol nor anger, even though after hitting a guy while drunk driving, pulled the other driver out of the truck, punched him so hard he was laid out cold on the street, and then left the scene. At the end of our first session, which was pretty intense because the ex didn't want to be there, he starts demanding the therapist give a percentage as to how much each of us were at fault. The therapist refused. The ex started yelling. The therapist finally relents. Fine. You. 99%. Her. Maybe 1%. That shut him up for a while. Kind of tangential, but when my parents were first starting their divorce, they went to mediation. After several sessions, the mediator suggested that, perhaps, the issues were not solely caused by my father. The next day, my mother got a lawyer and refused any further mediation. Look up narcissist covered narcissist. Everyone is the problem except them. They terrorize the family and create so much drama it's insane. Couples and family therapy intern. This is based on both my own experience and my fellow interns' experiences. Ironically, for affairs usually both people are to blame, except in extreme personality disorders. Example, wife is tired doing all of housework, childcare. Instead of asking clearly for help, she continues to white knight it, but no longer feels good and is stressed. When you don't feel good equals no sex, no emotional appreciation. A man finds sex life suddenly tanked or feels less love. He feels wife resentment or mood change, but doesn't know the cause. He feels pressure at work. He too starts getting stress. Home is no longer an emotional safe haven though. Boom, the void. One day someone actually listens and appreciates one member of the relationship. It leads to the affair. Most of the work is building the communication and affection. If handled well, the relationship can turn around. Now if the couple is coming in because of one person disordered behavior, this is a whole other ball game which I have less experience. Ask me in 5 years. Not a therapist, but we went into couples therapy after 28 years of marriage and a couple of difficult ones. After 3 sessions, the therapist told me to get lost and concentrated on my spouse for another 4. Then we got back together. She agreed to some changes, and we've been doing swimmingly ever since. Turns out she had some issues festering since pre-adolescence that she needed to talk out. I just needed a little more sex and a little less temper, and the therapist convinced her that these were reasonable accommodations. When my first marriage was spiraling down, we went to counseling. After 2 sessions, we had this conversation. X, we need to find a different counselor. Me, Y, X, she's taking your side. Oh. Not a therapist, but went to marriage counseling shortly after the birth of our daughter. He was extremely emotionally, verbally and financially abusive. I was trying to save our marriage. During our second session, the therapist straight up told him that he is exhibiting extremely abusive behavior and that he needs to seek help from a professional. 20 minutes before our next appointment, he called the therapist and told her that his son had broken his arm and we couldn't make it. This was a lie. His son was playing video games in the living room. I patiently sat through that marriage for 6 years after that. I am so thankful that now, finally, after 2 years, I am officially divorced from him. I just divorced an abusive husband. I'm so relieved to be done with him, but also, so freaking sad that our daughter isn't. He's nice to her now, she's 2, but I see him getting shorter with her and meaner to her. He spanks her for not listening. She's 2. I hate myself a little for having her with him. He became physically abusive with my son. I think he'll become abusive to her too. I have my degree in marriage and family therapy. Most models have the underlying assumption that the issues within a relationship have equal contributions from both parties. I also worked at a domestic violence shelter and believe adamantly that in an abusive relationship, presence of power and control, that the perpetrator is to blame. Not all couple and family therapists would agree with me on that. Now, I did not practice therapy for very long, so I can't claim to be an expert, but I think a lot of time the bias of the therapist can sneak in even when you work hard to be non-objective. There are deeper aspects to the theories, but in short, I would assume that both parties are to blame, with the exception of abuse. And I would try to look at aspects from multiple realtors at play. This includes outside factors that are to blame. I've done some marriage counseling with a few couples, and in all but one case of a woman who was just an out and out alcoholic. It's always a two-person thing, almost without fail. The saying is it takes two to have an affair. Yeah, I know it technically takes three or more, but it's true that most affairs are because of something happening at home. Just a side note to this question. You know what makes relationships really difficult? The fact that everyone hears one story from one party and automatically makes their final judgment on the other person. You know what that judgment almost always is when it comes to online advice? Leave that person. Now, whether or not someone actually asked for that type of advice, been married for 10 months or been together for years with someone and frick up once, do something bad where your partner goes online to ask help, don't worry, you'll just have thousands of strangers giving your partner advice to break up and question any of the relationship's previous history. That kind of sickens me, especially because relationships are so much more than that, and most people are really freaking bad at explaining the subtleties and nuances in one. God forbid a listener or person online giving advice actually goes out of their way with asking the right questions to ascertain what's maybe happening, right? Instead, they will literally judge an entire relationship in a few paragraphs from one person and condemn the other regardless of anything else. Some of the best advice I've ever heard when it comes to relationships is, don't take advice from someone who has nothing to lose for giving it. Remember, you know the relationship you're in. No one else does. The people who tell you advice usually know nothing about the great moments that made you fall in love in the first place. They have nothing to lose, but you have one of the loves of your life to lose. They don't know what is going on with the other person or why the person felt that way in the first place. They only know what one person complains about. Make sure you tell both sides of any story before asking for advice. If you can't do that, then make sure you tell someone the million reasons you love someone else in the first place. People will take your side, so remember to give examples of what makes the relationship great before telling even one bad thing. I used to work as a family therapist for a small clinic, including doing some analysis work, but have recently pursued more grander employment opportunities. I can say that it's never one person's fault, and a way to often bring this information to the light of day is a couple will suggest a trial separation where they stay romantically engaged but are free to go off and experience extramarital affairs. It never works. Somehow these people delude themselves into thinking it does. I keep allowing it because it might just work for the next couple. Well, my ex tried to kill me and each of our children on separate occasions and threatened suicide, including to our elder son when he was 6 years old. She refused any medical help and refused to go to couples therapy after our first visit. I kept going by myself. There's a lot more, but I feel comfortable saying that most of the problems were her fault. Clearly, if someone told you that, the obvious answer is fly off the handle. Act irrational and start babbling incoherently. That should speed up the process of getting to step 4, divorce. To those who think that a relationship problem can't be one person's fault, I'd like to invite you to frick right off. I've read through a relationship help book that took the approach of both people being the problem, and I wanted to set this book on fire. This philosopher blames victims of emotional and physical abuse. The idea that victims are to blame for their abuse is freaking insulting and dangerous, and no one who reads through this thread should believe this victim blaming lie. Saying that someone is to blame for being treated like crap because they chose to enter or stay in the relationship ignores the complexity of human beings and shifts the blame off of the abuser, giving them a justification for their horrible behavior. This philosophy ignores the fact that abusive people can be charming and manipulative. They can hide their red flags, either purposefully or subconsciously, and some people have low self-esteem and think they don't deserve better. Does that mean someone deserves to be abused because they believe they do? And once someone is in a relationship, they may stay because they are hoping that person will change, or they are in a financial situation that makes it difficult to get out, or that abuser has socially isolated them and convinced them that they don't deserve better. Threats of harm may be involved. Even if we're not talking about outright emotional or physical abuse, the idea that both people are always to blame is balls. Some people have a mental illness and some people are just selfish buttholes, and it's freaking terrible to blame victims of these relationship nightmares for their situation. It's never just one person's fault, but sometimes one person is more open to change and that's enough. And sometimes one person can be confronted and the other is too fragile. In the story where the therapist tells the wife she's wrong, the real plot change is that the therapist knew she could take being confronted and could initiate change. The husband may have been too defensive and rigid. Not a therapist, but I went to one when my marriage was failing. Ex wouldn't go. Nothing wrong with him, don't you know. Took 2 visits, then the therapist said he's never going to change. Accepted to leave. Turns out ex is an Asperger's. It took 2 to form a couple, and it'll take 2 to resolve conflict. The key is flexibility and the desire to sustain and nurture the best parts of what brought the couple together in the first place. If that desire is no longer there, then no sense in spending lots of money and time on therapists. My wife told me a story of a couple that came to see her. The wife wanted to be there. After a half hour, the husband admitted that he had no intention of staying in the relationship and was just doing this to keep up appearances with their church. He left her, but from what I knew of the relationship, they should have split long before and only stayed together because their religion didn't allow for divorce. Didn't happen to me, but my parents. They had couples counseling for a while and they really wanted to make the marriage work. But the marriage counselor kept telling my father that he needs to get out because there was no cooperating with someone like my mother. Honestly, I could believe it under the circumstances of her relationship with me, but that's just anecdotal. I was trained in Gorman method, currently at level 2. Usually it's not just one person. If one person has significant issues, the other usually isn't coping effectively. Not a therapist, but I did try to get an ex through couples counseling, except the ex became angry at the therapist as she felt attacked, and left, so didn't get that far. Yes, I got a divorce. Be careful who you marry. Not a therapist, but I remember reading that it's a bad idea for couples to list the reasons they love each other. Apparently this is because love isn't the most rational emotion, and the reason behind loving someone isn't something you can just point to. You can't take one broken person and one whole person and make a functioning couple. You also can't do this with 2 broken people. 2 whole people, you have some hope. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.